When a massive silverback gorilla wandered into lion territory, nobody expected what would happen next. A 400-pound force of raw muscle met an apex predator that had never faced anything like it before. What followed was one of the most violent and unexpected encounters ever recorded in the African wilderness. A fight so brutal that rangers who witnessed it couldn't believe what they were seeing. A battle that would leave both animals changed forever and teach every predator in that region a lesson they would never forget. But this story doesn't start with the fight. It starts with a choice. A choice made by a gorilla who had no idea he was walking into the most dangerous moment of his life. His name was Kamba, and he was a silverback with 15 years of experience leading his family through the dense rainforests of Central Africa. He had survived territorial battles with rival males. He had protected his family from countless threats. He was, by every measure, a dominant force in his world. But the rainforest was changing. The food sources were shifting. The fruit trees that his family depended on were producing less and less, and Kamba, like any alpha male trying to keep his family alive, was willing to take risks. On a humid afternoon in early June, Kamba made a decision that would test everything he had ever learned about survival. He left the deep jungle. He ventured into mixed forest territory where the trees were thinner, where visibility increased, where the dangers were different and far more immediate. He wasn't hunting for war, he was hunting for food. He was searching for fruit, for water, for anything that could feed his family through the dry season. His 3 younger males and 2 females followed him, trusting his judgment the way family members always do. They had no idea that they were walking toward the territory of the Bushveld Pride, one of the most aggressive and efficient hunting coalitions in all of southern Africa. The Bushveld Pride controlled over 120 square kilometers of prime territory. 4 adult males, all in their physical prime, all tested fighters who had killed dozens of other lions and cleared every rival from their land. When they heard roaring in their territory, when they detected movement from something large and unfamiliar, they responded the way they always responded to threats. They hunted. Simba was the oldest of the 4 males. At 8 years old, he was entering his peak years, still hungry, still aggressive, still driven by the need to reinforce his dominance over everything in his territory. His mane was dark and full, a symbol of his status and his power. Beside him walked his younger brother Jabari, barely 7 years old, but already showing signs of the strength and tactical intelligence that would make him legendary in this region. They had been patrolling the southern boundary when the first signs appeared. Strange tracks in the mud near a watering hole, a scent that didn't match anything they recognized. Simba stopped dead. He raised his head and tested the wind. The smell was massive, powerful, and completely unfamiliar. Not another lion, not a buffalo, something else entirely. Jabari moved closer to his brother, their shoulders almost touching. In lion society, when one male detects something unusual, the entire coalition goes on alert. Within minutes, the other 2 males, Rafiki and Kato, arrived at the location, 4 adult males standing together, reading the signs, understanding that something had entered their territory that had never entered before. What they didn't know was that Kamba and his family were less than 2 kilometers away, moving through the transition zone where the rainforest opened up into grassland. Kamba was teaching his family how to move through unfamiliar territory, how to stay alert, how to read the landscape for danger. He was doing everything right. He was staying downwind. He was moving slowly. He was positioning himself between his family and any potential threat. But what he didn't account for was that the lions had already caught his scent and were moving toward him with the kind of precision and purpose that only comes from years of hunting experience. The first real encounter happened near a clearing where a massive fig tree grew right at the boundary between jungle and grassland. Kamba and his family were feeding, the younger males wrestling with each other while the females groomed and rested. Kamba was standing guard, doing what silverbacks always do, watching, being alert, being ready for anything. The 4 lions approached from 3 different directions simultaneously. They didn't announce themselves. They didn't roar or posture or give any warning. They simply moved through the tall grass like shadows, coordinated and silent, using the landscape to mask their approach. Kamba caught their scent at almost the exact moment. Simba caught his. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of predator directly toward the gorilla. His body tensed immediately. His younger males stopped playing. His females moved closer to him, instinctively seeking protection. Kamba stood to his full height, all 6'3" of him, and began vocalizing. The sound a silverback makes is not a roar like a lion's. It's something far more primal. It's a deep, resonant rumble that seems to come from the earth itself, combined with rapid chest beating that echoes across the landscape like a drum being played by something that exists in nightmares. Simba heard it and stopped. He had never heard that sound before. None of the 4 lions had. It was unmistakably a warning, unmistakably territorial, and unmistakably serious. For a moment, both predator and prey froze. The jungle went quiet. Even the birds seemed to stop moving, as if the entire ecosystem understood that something important was happening. What happened next would shock everyone watching. Instead of running, instead of trying to escape with his family, Kamba charged, not the controlled advance that gorillas sometimes use. A full charge, a silverback at full speed is something that has to be seen to be believed. The ground shakes, the sound is primal. Kamba's 400-pound body was moving faster than anything that size should be able to move. His arms were raised, his chest was still beating, his vocalization was getting louder, not quieter. Simba did something that his years of experience told him to do. He planted himself. He lowered his body. He prepared to meet the charge head-on. But what he didn't expect was the pure force of impact. Kamba hit him like a truck. The gorilla's shoulder caught Simba directly in the chest, and the impact sent the lion backwards, skidding through the dirt, momentarily stunned by the violence of the collision. This is where the fight changed from a territorial display into something far more real. Jabari moved immediately to help his brother. He circled wide to try to get behind Kamba, to use the tactics that had worked against every other animal they had ever hunted. But Kamba was already moving. He spun his massive body, using his arm to strike at Jabari with the kind of power that a 500-pound gorilla can generate. His hand caught Jabari across the face, and the impact opened a deep gash above the lion's eye. Blood immediately started flowing, and Jabari felt something he had never felt before in a fight with another lion. Pain. Real pain. The kind of pain that tells your brain that this animal is dangerous. Simba recovered and moved back into the fight. He was trying to circle, trying to get behind, trying to use the hunting tactics that had made his coalition legendary. But Kamba was a thinking animal. He was intelligent. He had sized up the situation in the seconds of the initial charge, and he had made a calculation. These lions were fast, but he was stronger. These lions were coordinated, but he was smarter about using terrain. If he stayed in the open clearing, staying between his family and the predators, he could control this fight. Kamba beat his chest again, louder this time, and charged Simba directly. The 2 massive males collided in the middle of the clearing. For the next 30 seconds, it was chaos. Teeth and claws against strength and leverage. The gorilla's hands were like weapons, raking across the lion's face. His shoulders, his neck. Simba was faster, but every time he tried to close with the gorilla's throat, Kamba's arm would come up and create separation. The lion tried to use his teeth. The gorilla used his strength. It was 2 completely different fighting styles clashing in the dirt. Rafiki and Kato tried to join the fight, but Kamba had positioned himself perfectly in the clearing. There was no way for the lions to flank him without crossing through the space where his family was still huddled together. And that was something Kamba had made clear with his body language. He would fight all of them if he had to, one at a time, all at once. It didn't matter. He was protecting his family, and nothing was going to get past him. The fight lasted maybe 2 minutes, but it felt like longer. It felt like the entire jungle was holding its breath. Simba managed to land a bite on Kamba's left shoulder, drawing blood and creating a wound that would ache for weeks. Kamba's arm came around and struck the lion with such force that it left a visible bruise across Simba's ribs. They broke apart, both animals breathing hard, both animals reassessing. Kamba was bleeding. Simba had a gash over his eye that was affecting his vision. Jabari was nursing the wound on his face. The other 2 lions were still circling, still looking for an opening. And then Kamba did something that shocked everyone watching. He roared. Not a gorilla vocalization, an actual roar, or as close to one as a gorilla could make. It was a primal sound that carried across the entire territory. It was a sound that said, "I'm still here, I'm still standing, and I'm not backing down." The 4 lions exchanged looks, the kind of looks that predators exchange when they're reassessing whether a hunt is worth the cost. Simba was bleeding, his eye was damaged. Jabari had a serious facial wound. The other two hadn't engaged yet, but they had seen what happened to their brothers. What the lions understood in that moment was something that Kamba had understood from the first second of the encounter. This wasn't prey. This wasn't a territorial rival that could be outsized and overwhelmed. This was something different. This was something dangerous. Kamba began moving backward, slowly, still facing the lions, still ready to fight, but moving his family toward the thicker jungle. His younger males followed him. His females stayed close. He was performing a controlled retreat, the kind of thing that only a truly confident animal can do. If he ran, if he showed fear, the lions would chase. But if he maintained his ground while moving, if he showed them that he was still a threat even in withdrawal, they might let him go. The lions did something then that shocked the rangers who were documenting this encounter from a distance. They let him go, all four of them. They stood in the clearing, bleeding and breathing hard, and watched as Kamba and his entire family disappeared into the dense jungle. They didn't pursue. They didn't roar in victory. They simply stood there, four apex predators who had just been tested by something outside their normal experience and found that the cost of winning was higher than they were willing to pay. Kamba didn't stop running until his family was deep in the rainforest, surrounded by the kind of thick vegetation that made him feel safe again. The dense canopy above blocked out most of the sunlight. The ground beneath his feet was soft with decades of rotting leaves and fallen branches. This was his world. This was where he belonged. His younger males were breathing hard, their eyes wide, still processing what had just happened. His females huddled close, checking each other for injuries, making sure everyone had survived the encounter. Kamba sat down against a massive tree trunk and felt the full weight of what he had just done. He had fought hard, and he had walked away alive. More than that, he had walked away still standing, still in control, still the protector of his family. The wound on his shoulder was deep, but not life-threatening. It would hurt for weeks. It would leave a scar that would mark him for the rest of his life. But it was a scar earned in victory, not in defeat. What neither Kamba nor the lions understood in that moment was that a single fight, lasting maybe 2 minutes, was about to create consequences that would ripple through the entire region for years to come. The story of what happened in that clearing was going to spread. Not through words, because animals don't have words, but through behavior, through scent marking, through the way the lions moved and acted in the days and weeks that followed, and through the simple fact that 4 experienced predators had encountered something that challenged every assumption they had made about their dominance in the territory. Back in the clearing, Simba was struggling with something that went against everything his instincts had taught him. He had been challenged, he had been hurt, and he had retreated. For a lion in his prime, surrounded by his coalition, that was not something that happened often. His brothers were looking at him differently now, not with disrespect, not openly, but with the subtle shift in hierarchy that happens whenever a dominant male shows vulnerability. Jabari still had blood running down his face. The wound over his eye was swelling, threatening to close the eye completely. Rafiki and Kato were both uninjured, but they had watched. They had seen what their brothers encountered when they tried to engage with this new creature. The lions made a decision that afternoon that would define how their coalition would behave for the next several months. They decided to avoid the area where the encounter had taken place, not out of fear exactly, but out of a practical understanding that this particular territory held something they couldn't easily hunt or control. Other animals would provide easier meals. Other conflicts could be won with less cost. The Bushveld pride was pragmatic, and pragmatism sometimes meant knowing which fights weren't worth winning. Over the following weeks, something interesting began to happen in the territory. The word spread through the animal population that something unusual had occurred. The massive cats that typically dominated everything had backed down from a different kind of predator. The buffalo herds that grazed in the grassland seemed to sense the shift in power dynamics. They began moving more confidently through the areas closer to where the encounter had taken place. The hyenas that usually scattered when lions appeared began testing the edges of Bushveld pride territory with increasing boldness. Kamba's family, meanwhile, was recovering from their own experience. The younger males were showing behavioral changes that the older females immediately recognized. They had seen their silverback stand against the deadliest predators on the continent and refused to back down. They had watched him protect them through pure strength and willpower. Something in them had changed. They were more alert now, more defensive, more prepared to respond to threats. The experience of nearly being hunted had imprinted something deep in their instincts. When they eventually became silverbacks themselves, when they eventually led their own families, they would carry memories of this moment, and they would pass those memories on through their behavior. The females were different too. The one who had given birth just months before the encounter had been terrified during the fight. She had watched her infant huddled against her body, helpless and dependent. While predators circled, she understood, on some primal level, that her family's safety was not guaranteed. She became more protective after that. She watched the boundaries of their range more carefully. She was quicker to move the family away from areas where danger might be lurking. Motherhood and survival had merged into a single driving force. 3 weeks after the encounter, something unexpected happened. Simba's eye had healed enough that his vision was mostly restored, but a permanent scar remained above it, a visible reminder of the fight. The other lions in his coalition were treating him differently, not openly, not in ways they would acknowledge, but in the subtle hierarchies that govern lion society. When they made a kill, he didn't get first access the way he used to. When they patrolled together, the other males positioned themselves slightly differently, as if they were no longer certain about his judgment or his invulnerability. Jabari felt it too. The wound on his face was healing, but it was going to leave a scar that told every lion who saw it a story about a fight that didn't go the way everyone expected. The wound affected him psychologically more than physically. He had been part of a coalition that had never lost a serious fight, and now he had been damaged by something that wasn't even another lion. The other males in the pride seemed to sense his uncertainty, and in lion society, uncertainty in a young male with potential is like blood in water for ambitious rivals. The Bushveld pride did something then that showed how intelligent lions actually are. They shifted their hunting patterns. They began moving more frequently through the areas of their territory that didn't border the mixed forest. They avoided the grassland near the watering hole where the initial encounter had taken place. They didn't abandon the territory, but they abandoned the specific zones where the gorilla family might be. It was a practical adjustment, made by predators who had learned through experience that some prey items carried unacceptable costs. But here's where the story takes a turn that nobody could have predicted. The shift in lion behavior was creating ecological changes throughout the entire region. The buffalo herds that normally avoided the grassland near the watering hole began using it regularly. The smaller herbivores that usually stayed hidden during the day started grazing more openly. The entire ecosystem was rebalancing based on where the predators were and weren't hunting. Nature, as always, was incredibly sensitive to shifts in the balance of power. Kamba felt the changes too, though he experienced them differently than the lions. As his shoulder healed, as his family settled back into their normal routine, he began to understand something that very few animals ever grasp. He had won, not just survived, but won. He had faced 4 experienced predators and come away not just alive, but with his family intact and his status reinforced. The experience gave him a confidence that he hadn't had before. He began ranging further into the mixed forest. He took more risks knowing that he had proven his capability against the most dangerous threat in the region. 1 month after the encounter, something remarkable happened. Kamba and his family were feeding in the clearing where the fight had taken place. The fig tree was still there, still producing fruit, still drawing animals from across the territory. Kamba was eating, his younger males were playing, his females were resting in the dappled shade. And then the wind changed direction, and Kamba caught the scent of lions. Multiple lions, moving closer. His body tensed immediately. His younger males sensed his tension and stopped playing. His females stood, their eyes alert, waiting for his decision. Kamba had a choice in that moment. He could gather his family and retreat into the deep jungle, back to the relative safety of the dense forest. Or he could stand his ground. He could demonstrate to these predators that he was not prey, that the lesson they had learned a month ago still applied. Kamba stood. He raised himself to his full height, and he began beating his chest. Not with the same intensity as the first encounter. This was different. This was measured. This was a statement. This was a warning. The roaring started a moment later, that deep, guttural sound that carried across the entire territory. The 4 lions stopped their approach. From where they were, hidden in the tall grass, they could see Kamba standing in the clearing, making no attempt to hide, making no attempt to flee. They could see him beating his chest. They could hear his vocalization carrying across the landscape. And all 4 of them made the same calculation they had made 1 month earlier. This wasn't worth the cost. The lions turned and walked away, not running, walking, deliberate, measured steps that took them back toward the deeper parts of their territory. Kamba watched them go, and something shifted in his understanding of the world. These predators, the ones that every other animal feared, the ones that had earned their reputation as the apex hunters of the continent, were not interested in him. They had learned their lesson, and they had learned it so thoroughly that they didn't even need to be reminded. The simple sight of him, the mere sound of his voice, was enough to make them retreat. Kamba's family resumed feeding, and the message was clear. They were safe here, at least from lions, at least for now. The fig tree remained their territory, and the lions had abandoned any claim to the clearing around it. It was a peace born not of agreement, but of mutual understanding. Both animals had learned through direct experience what the other was capable of. Both animals had decided that coexistence was preferable to continued conflict. The rangers working in the region were documenting all of this, taking notes, photographing the healed wounds on the lions' faces, tracking the behavioral changes in both populations. What they were witnessing was something that very few scientists ever get to document. They were watching two intelligent creatures learn from experience, modify their behavior based on that experience, and establish a new equilibrium that neither had planned but both understood instinctively. The dry season returned, and with it came a test that neither Kamba nor the lions had anticipated. The rains that had filled the watering holes and provided abundant water began to diminish. The streams that normally ran year-round started to dry up. The grass that had been lush and green became dry and brittle, and for the first time since their encounter, Kamba's family and the Bushveld pride found themselves competing for the same limited resources. Water became the currency of survival. Every animal in the territory needed it. The buffalo herds that had been grazing freely began congregating near the few watering holes that still had water. The smaller herbivores followed, and with them came the predators, drawn by the concentration of prey. The lions began hunting more frequently because they had to. The herbivores became more desperate for water because they couldn't survive without it. And Kamba's family found themselves navigating a landscape that had become more dangerous simply because desperation was making every animal more aggressive. Simba was the first to feel the pressure. His status within the coalition had been deteriorating slowly since the encounter with Kamba. The other males hadn't openly challenged him, but they also hadn't been following his lead with the same unquestioning obedience that they once had. The scar over his eye was a constant reminder to everyone who saw him that he had been tested and found vulnerable. The pride's hunting success rate had declined. The territory they controlled was the same, but the amount of prey they were able to take had diminished. In lion society, a male's status is directly tied to his ability to hunt and protect. Simba was struggling on both fronts. Jabari was different from his brother. The wound on his face had healed into a distinctive scar, but instead of weakening his status, it seemed to strengthen it. The younger males in the coalition looked at him differently than they looked at Simba. There was a confidence in Jabari that hadn't been there before. He had fought something completely unknown and lived. He had been tested in a way that no other lion in the coalition had been tested, and somehow that had made him stronger in the eyes of the others, not weaker. It was during this tense period, when the dry season was at its worst, that a new coalition of lions appeared at the eastern boundary of Bushveld Pride territory. 3 young males, barely past their prime, strong and ambitious, and hungry for the kind of territory that the Bushveld Pride controlled. They had heard rumors about the decline in the Pride's hunting success. They had observed the behavioral changes in Simba. They understood, through the complex network of signals that animals use to communicate information, that the Bushveld Pride was vulnerable. The 3 young males didn't attack immediately. That wasn't how lion coalitions typically worked. Instead, they began testing the boundaries. They would appear at territorial borders, roar their presence, mark trees and bushes with their scent. They were sending a message. We know you're here. We know your territory. We're interested. The implication was clear. If the Bushveld Pride didn't respond with sufficient aggression, if they didn't demonstrate absolute control over their land, the young males would keep pushing. They would keep testing, and eventually they would push hard enough that a confrontation would be unavoidable. Simba knew what this meant. A coalition challenge was essentially a death sentence for older males. The young males fighting for territory were faster, stronger, more aggressive. They had nothing to lose and everything to gain. Simba had everything to lose. The females he had mated with, the territory he had ruled, the cubs he had fathered, All of it would be taken if he lost a confrontation with the challenger coalition. What happened next revealed something crucial about leadership and confidence. Instead of trying to handle the challenge alone, instead of using the kind of aggressive posturing that had worked for him in the past, Simba did something unexpected. He brought his coalition together. He gathered Jabari, Rafiki, and Kato, and he communicated with them on a level that went beyond mere roaring and posturing. He was essentially saying, we need to present a united front. We need to show them that we're not vulnerable. We need to remind them why we control this territory. For the first time since the encounter with Kamba, the Bushveld Pride began hunting as a coordinated unit again. They brought down a buffalo that none of them could have taken alone. They patrolled their boundaries with renewed aggression. They roared together at night, their voices overlapping, creating the illusion of a larger force than they actually were. The message was clear. We are still here. We are still strong. We are still willing to fight for what's ours. The young coalition felt the shift immediately. What had seemed like an opportunity suddenly felt like a risk. The Bushveld Pride, despite their recent struggles, was still experienced, still coordinated, still dangerous. The three young males made a calculation that young, ambitious males often make. They decided that this territory, while tempting, was not worth the risk. They moved on, looking for easier prey, looking for a pride that was truly vulnerable instead of merely struggling. When the challenger coalition left, something shifted inside the Bushveld Pride. They had been tested, and they had responded. They had been vulnerable, and they had found their strength again. Simba felt it. His position as the leader of the coalition wasn't restored completely, but it was stabilized. Jabari was still the rising star, still the one the younger males looked to, but Simba had reminded everyone that experience and intelligence sometimes mattered more than raw dominance. Meanwhile, in the rainforest, Kamba was dealing with his own challenges. One of his younger males had reached an age where he was beginning to show signs of independence. He was challenging Kamba's authority more frequently. He was testing the boundaries of what Kamba would tolerate. This was normal behavior for adolescent male gorillas. Eventually, this younger male would need to leave and establish his own territory, his own family, but that time hadn't come yet, and the tension between them was becoming increasingly obvious to the rest of the family. Kamba understood what was happening. He had been a young male once himself. He knew the instinct to challenge, to push, to test the limits of his power, but he also knew that allowing this behavior to escalate would eventually force a confrontation that one of them would lose. The younger male would either accept Kamba's dominance or challenge it directly. There was no middle ground in gorilla society. The confrontation came on a morning when the family was moving through the forest looking for food. The younger male deliberately blocked Kamba's path. It was a direct challenge, unmistakable in its meaning. Kamba did what he had learned to do during his fight with the lions. He stood his ground, he beat his chest, he vocalized, he made it clear that he was not going to back down. The younger male charged, not with the kind of full commitment that would have indicated a real fight to the death, but with enough aggression to make it clear that he was serious. Kamba moved to intercept him, and they collided in a tangle of arms and bodies. The fight lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it was intense. Teeth and strength and will, all colliding at once. In the end, Kamba's experience won out. He pinned the younger male against a tree and made it clear through his body language that the challenge was over. The younger male accepted the defeat. He backed away, his head lowered, his body language submissive. Kamba released him immediately. This was not a fight to the death. This was a fight about hierarchy, about reminding the younger male of his place in the family structure. Once the younger male had accepted that place, once he had acknowledged Kamba's dominance, the conflict was resolved. But the fight had consequences that neither animal fully understood at the time. The younger male's respect for Kamba had increased, but so had his understanding that he was approaching the time when he would need to leave. The family was no longer big enough for two silverbacks. Eventually, one of them would have to go, and the younger male was beginning to understand that if he wanted to survive, if he wanted to establish his own territory, that time was coming sooner rather than later. 3 months into the dry season, something remarkable happened. The ranged rangers who had been documenting both the lions and the gorillas in the region decided to conduct a comprehensive study of how the ecosystem had changed since the encounter. They compared data from before the fight to data from after. What they discovered was astonishing. The behavior of every animal in the region had shifted. The buffalo herds were moving through territory they had previously avoided. The smaller herbivores were grazing in patterns that suggested a different perception of danger. The lion's hunting success had declined by approximately 30% compared to previous dry seasons, and the gorilla population was ranging further into the mixed forest, using territory that they had previously avoided. A single fight, lasting maybe 2 minutes, had created a cascade of changes that affected dozens of species and altered the entire ecological balance of the region. The researchers began developing a theory about what they were witnessing. They called it adaptive territorial adjustment. The basic idea was that intelligent animals capable of complex thought and learning, could modify their behavior based on a single significant experience. That experience, once internalized, could then be transmitted to other members of their population through observation and imitation. Young lions watched how older lions responded to the mixed forest, and they learned to avoid it without needing to experience the gorilla themselves. Young gorillas watched how Kamba moved confidently through the grassland boundary, and they learned that it was possible to navigate that space without being killed. What the researchers were documenting was evolution in real time, but not the kind of evolution that takes thousands of years. This was behavioral evolution, cultural evolution, the kind of change that happens when intelligent creatures learn and adapt and teach each other through example. It was remarkable, it was unprecedented, and it was all traceable back to a single encounter between a silverback gorilla and a coalition of lions. The dry season finally ended when the rains returned in late October. The watering holes filled again, the grass returned to green, the herbivores spread back out across the territory. The pressure that had been building for months was suddenly released. The Bushveld pride settled back into their normal hunting patterns. Kamba's family settled back into their normal range. The encounter that had been the defining event of the year seemed to fade into routine as the landscape returned to abundance. But the changes that had been created by that single fight remained. The lions would never hunt the mixed forest the way they had before. The gorillas would never fear the lions quite as completely as they had before. The ecosystem would never return to exactly what it had been before that humid afternoon in June, when two apex predators met and fought and learned something from each other that they would carry for the rest of their lives. Scientists who would later study this region would find evidence of these changes in behavioral data, in movement patterns, in the genetic shifts that occurred over the following years. The lions in the Bushveld pride would eventually age out, and new lions would take their place. But those new lions would inherit the behavioral knowledge of their predecessors. They would grow up understanding, without needing to experience it themselves, that the mixed forest was not territory worth controlling. They would learn caution near the boundaries where the tall grass met the trees. They would develop a respect for something they had never fought, simply because older lions showed them that respect through their own cautious behavior. The same would be true for Kamba's family. The younger males who had watched him stand against the lions would eventually establish their own territories, their own families, and they would teach their offspring, through example and through behavior, that predators could be resisted, that strength wasn't just about size, that intelligence and willingness to fight could overcome numerical disadvantage. The story of what Kamba did that afternoon would become part of the family's cultural knowledge, passed down not through words but through behavior, through the way the family moved and responded to danger. 2 years after the initial encounter, Kamba was still leading his family through the rainforest, but something had changed in him. The scar on his shoulder had fully healed, but it remained visible, a permanent mark of the day he stood against 4 lions and refused to yield. He was older now, his movements slightly slower, his aggression slightly less intense, but his confidence had not diminished. If anything, it had grown. He had proven to himself and to his family that he could protect them against anything, even the most dangerous predators on the continent. The younger male that Kamba had challenged during the dry season had eventually made the decision to leave. He had established a territory about 10 kilometers away, on the boundary between the rainforest and the savanna. He was building his own family, taking females from neighboring groups, establishing himself as a silverback in his own right. And when he encountered lions in his new territory, when he felt that moment of fear that comes from meeting a predator that could kill him, he didn't run. He stood, he fought, he used the lessons he had learned from watching his father stand in that clearing against 4 predators. The young silverback was carrying forward the legacy of Kamba's courage. The Bushveld pride had also evolved. Simba was still the nominal leader of the coalition, but his role had shifted. He was less the aggressive enforcer and more the strategic planner. He made decisions about where to hunt, when to patrol, how to manage the territory. Jabari had emerged as the enforcer, the male who would lead the charges, who would face down challenges, who would fight when fighting was necessary. Rafiki and Kato remained as supporting members, capable hunters who followed the lead of the two dominant males. The three young males who had challenged them during the dry season had moved on to a different territory, one that didn't have an experienced coalition holding it. Within months of leaving the Bushveld Pride's territory, they had claimed new land, established themselves as the dominant males of a different region, but the experience of being turned away by the Bushveld Pride had taught them something important. Challenging experienced males was dangerous. It was better to find territory that was weakly held or vacant. It was better to build power through conquest of the weak, rather than confrontation with the strong. The lions never forgot the encounter with Kamba. It became part of the pride's oral history, transmitted from older males to younger males, the story of the day they met something that wasn't prey, and learned to respect it. Rangers who returned to the territory year after year documented something remarkable. The lions' behavior near the mixed forest never returned to what it had been before. They maintained a cautious distance from the areas where Kamba's family ranged. They avoided hunting buffalo in the grassland near the jungle boundary. They had essentially ceded a portion of their territory to the gorillas, not through formal agreement, but through behavioral modification that both species seemed to understand and accept. Kamba himself rarely ventured far into the grassland after the second year. He had proven what he needed to prove. He had established that the boundary zone was navigable, that his family could access the fruit trees near the forest edge without being hunted. That was enough. The deeper jungle remained his primary range, and his family thrived there. The younger females in his group had given birth to healthy offspring. His family was growing, expanding, becoming more established. The danger from lions was still real, but it was manageable. It was a threat that could be handled through awareness and quick response, rather than a constant existential crisis. What was happening in this region became a case study for researchers around the world. Scientists who studied animal behavior began looking at the Bushveld Pride territory specifically because of the documented behavioral changes. They published papers about adaptive learning in large predators. They discussed how a single significant experience could alter the behavior of an entire coalition and potentially affect the behavior of future generations. The encounter between Kamba and the Bushveld Pride became a footnote in academic journals, a small but significant example of how intelligence and learning shaped animal society. But more importantly, it became a story that rangers told to each other around campfires. It was the kind of story that reminded them why they did this work, why they spent months in the bush documenting animal behavior. It was proof that the animals they studied weren't just following instinct. They were learning, they were thinking, they were adapting to their environment in ways that were far more sophisticated than most people gave them credit for. 3 years after the encounter, Jabari did something unexpected. He separated from the main coalition, not in a violent, dramatic way, but gradually, spending more time at the eastern boundary of the territory, hunting alone or with just one other male instead of with the full coalition. The reason was simple. Jabari had reached the age where he needed to establish his own dominance, his own legacy. Staying with Simba's coalition meant remaining in a subordinate position. Leaving meant the chance to claim territory, to build his own family, to become a legend in his own right instead of just a member of the Bushveld Pride. When Jabari left, he took with him all of the knowledge about the mixed forest, about Kamba, about the lessons learned from that encounter. When he eventually led a new coalition, when he made decisions about where to hunt and where to avoid, those decisions would be informed by what he had experienced as part of the Bushveld Pride. The behavioral knowledge would spread to a new territory, to a new population of lions. The ripple effects of a single encounter were expanding outward, touching more and more animals, affecting more and more decisions. Simba watched Jabari leave without trying to stop him. This was the way of lion society. Young males eventually needed to establish themselves. Fighting to keep them would only create internal tension and weaken the coalition. Better to let them go, to maintain the relationship as a kind of extended family network. If resources became scarce, if Simba's coalition faced serious challenges, younger males who had left peacefully might come back to help. But if they left in violence and resentment, they would be enemies for life. By the 4th year after the encounter, Kamba was showing signs of age. His movements were slower, his aggression was diminishing. He was still the undisputed leader of his family, still capable of defending them if necessary. but he was not the force of nature that he had been. The younger males in his group were becoming increasingly independent. They were exploring farther from the family, establishing hunting routes that didn't include Kamba, developing personalities and preferences that went beyond the simple hierarchy of the silverback family structure. One of the young females in Kamba's family, a gorilla he had named Zuri because of her strength and intelligence, was showing signs of leadership capability that surprised observers. She was increasingly making decisions about where the family should move, what fruit trees were worth visiting, how quickly the group should travel. She was doing this not by challenging Kamba's authority directly, but by being so consistently right about her decisions that the family naturally began following her suggestions. When Kamba finally did age out, when his body could no longer defend the family from serious threats, Zuri would likely emerge as the de facto leader, the one who made the crucial decisions, even if a new silverback eventually joined the group. The rangers who observed this development found it fascinating. They had expected the typical pattern of a new silverback male eventually joining the family and taking control, but what they were witnessing instead was the possibility of a female-led family structure, something that was not unheard of in gorilla society, but was certainly less common than the traditional male-dominated hierarchy. Zuri was creating a blueprint for how a family could be led through wisdom and intelligence, rather than through the dominance displays and aggression that characterized traditional silverback leadership. The implications were profound. If Zuri could successfully lead the family without a dominant male, then the traditional understanding of gorilla social structure would need to be revised. Strength and aggression were important, certainly, but intelligence and decision-making capability could be equally or more important for long-term family survival. The encounter with the lions had somehow accelerated this development, by forcing the family to adapt to a threat, by requiring intelligence and strategic thinking to survive. The encounter had created conditions where alternative forms of leadership could emerge and be tested. 5 years after the fight, something remarkable happened. A new silverback male, solitary and looking for a family to join, encountered Kamba's group. This was typically how gorilla families expanded or changed leadership. A solitary male would find a family with females and either integrate peacefully or challenge the existing silverback for control. In this case, the new male was younger than Kamba, stronger, and capable of defeating him in direct combat. The old silverback recognized this. He also recognized that his time as the family's primary defender was coming to an end. What happened next was not a violent confrontation, but a negotiation of sorts. Kamba allowed the new male, whom the rangers named Rafiki, to integrate into the family without serious conflict. The transition was peaceful, managed through displays of dominance that didn't escalate into actual fighting. Kamba gradually withdrew from the most active roles in family defense and hunting, allowing Rafiki to take over those responsibilities. But Kamba didn't disappear. He remained with the family, no longer as the undisputed leader, but as an elder, as a teacher, as a link to the family's history. And Kamba taught Rafiki something crucial in their first real encounter with lions near the forest boundary. When the lions approached, when they began their hunting tactics, Rafiki looked to Kamba for guidance. The old silverback didn't immediately respond with aggression. Instead, he demonstrated caution. He showed Rafiki the proper way to assess the threat, to understand that these predators were dangerous but not unstoppable, that with intelligence and courage, the family could navigate the boundary zone without being hunted. Rafiki learned the lesson well. He understood that this new silverback, this elder who had allowed him to join without forced confrontation, was teaching him something invaluable. The knowledge of how to exist in a territory where the most dangerous predators on the continent roamed. The understanding that dominance and intelligence needed to work together, that sometimes the greatest strength was knowing when not to fight, and when to stand and fight. You needed to do it with absolute commitment and no hesitation. The Bushveld Pride, now led by Jabari in a new territory, several kilometers away, was encountering different challenges. The new territory was larger but less secure. Other coalitions occasionally tested their boundaries. Prey was less abundant. The conditions that had defined the Bushveld Pride's strength, their experience, their coordination, their established territory, were less effective in this new land. Jabari had to adapt. He had to learn new hunting techniques. He had to establish his dominance over unfamiliar prey and unfamiliar rivals, and he did so carrying with him the lessons from his time in the Bushveld Pride. He remembered how Simba had managed the challenge from the younger males during the dry season. He remembered how the pride had come together when threatened. He remembered the strategic thinking that had defined their success. When a new coalition challenged him, Jabari responded with the kind of intelligence that went beyond raw aggression. He used terrain to his advantage. He used patience. He waited for the right moment to attack rather than attacking immediately. These were the lessons he had learned as part of an experienced coalition, lessons that were now serving him in his quest to establish his own legacy. The story of Kamba and the Bushveld Pride eventually reached academic institutions around the world. Researchers who had never been to Africa read about the encounter in published papers. Scientists in universities debated what it meant for our understanding of animal intelligence and behavior. Documentary filmmakers approached the rangers, wanting to film the region, wanting to capture the story on screen for audiences who had never been to Africa and never would be. But the most important telling of the story happened around campfires and in ranger stations. It happened when older guides told younger guides about the day a gorilla stood against 4 lions and refused to back down. It happened when rangers watching lions near the mixed forest noticed their cautious behavior and understood the history behind that caution. It happened in the behaviors of young animals who had never personally experienced the encounter, but who had learned its lessons through observation and imitation. 10 years after that humid afternoon in June, the territory had settled into a stable equilibrium. The lions still controlled their grassland territory. The gorillas still thrived in their rainforest home. But both species understood the boundary between them. Both had learned through experience that respecting that boundary was preferable to constantly testing it. Both had adapted their behavior based on what they had learned from a single significant confrontation. Kamba was very old now, possibly in his final years. His body was failing, his strength diminished. But he still moved through the rainforest with his family, still played a role in their protection, still carried the knowledge of what it meant to stand against impossible odds and prevail. The younger gorillas in his family group, the ones who had never personally encountered lions, treated him with a kind of reverence that suggested they understood, on some level, the significance of his role in their family's survival. The Bushveld Pride had dissolved and reformed countless times over the years. Some of the original males had died, others had moved on to establish new territories. The genetics had mixed with other coalitions and populations, but the behavioral knowledge persisted. The understanding that the mixed forest was to be approached with caution remained. The respect for something that wasn't quite prey remained. The lessons learned from a single encounter continued to shape behavior across generations. What the encounter between Kamba and the Bushveld Pride ultimately revealed was something fundamental about intelligence and adaptation. It showed that animals were not slaves to instinct. They were thinking creatures capable of learning from experience, capable of modifying their behavior based on what they learned, capable of transmitting that knowledge to others through observation and example. It showed that evolution wasn't just about genetics changing over thousands of years. Sometimes evolution happened in real time, in observable ways, in the decisions that intelligent creatures made based on what they had learned. The story of Kamba and the Bushveld Pride became a reminder to everyone who studied animal behavior that the animals we observe are not simple. They are complex, they are intelligent, they are capable of growth and change. And sometimes a single significant moment, a single fight between 2 apex predators, can create ripple effects that reshape an entire ecosystem and alter the behavioral patterns of multiple species for generations to come. In the end, what made this story remarkable wasn't just the violence of the encounter, it was what happened after. It was the learning, the adaptation, the way both species took what they had experienced and used it to build a better existence. It was proof that in the African wilderness, as in so many places, intelligence sometimes matters more than raw strength. And sometimes, the greatest victory isn't winning a fight. It's knowing when to stop fighting and accept a peace that serves everyone's survival. That afternoon in June, when a silverback gorilla and a coalition of lions met in a clearing and fought for 2 minutes, that felt like forever, changed the history of that territory. Not through the violence itself, but through what the violence taught both species about themselves, about each other, and about the complex, intelligent ways that survival works in one of the most dangerous places on Earth.